Welcome back to episode 53 of the Henry George Daily Devotional. I went out of town for a wedding that was successful. The bride and groom did indeed get married. And now I'm back, and we're in chapter 4, the effect of the expectation raised by material progress. We are in book 4 of effective material progress upon the distribution of wealth. And we dispatched earlier things about population going up and labor advances or advances in labor saving technology. I don't know. Go listen or read for yourself. Here we go. George writes, "We have now seen that while advancing population tends to advance rent, so all the causes that in a progressive state of society operate to increase the productive power of labor tend also to advance rent and not to advance wages or interest." All right, this is what we have observed. Rent goes up. And rent, of course, is what we mean here is land rent, the return to the owners of land, or the return to land. The increased production of wealth goes ultimately to the new owners. Wait, I put in the word new. The increased production of wealth goes ultimately to the owners of land in increased rent. And although, as improvement goes on, advantages may accrue to individuals, not landholders, which concentrate in their hands considerable portions of the increased produce, yet there is in all this improvement nothing which tends to increase the general return either to labor or to capital. But there is a cause not yet adverted to. One of George's favorite words. Past tense of advert. Yes, clearly. Adverted. To make reference or speak briefly but specifically. Yes. Not yet adverted to. Which must be taken into consideration fully to explain the influence of material progress upon the distribution of wealth. All right, Justin, what do you think? What is the cause that we have not yet adverted to? Here, George says, that cause is the confident expectation of the future enhancement of land values, which arises in all progressive countries from the steady increase of rent, which leads to speculation, or the holding of land for a higher price than it would otherwise bring. We have hitherto assumed, as is generally assumed in elucidations of the theory of rent, that the actual margin of cultivation always coincides with what may be termed the necessary margin of cultivation. That is to say, we have assumed that cultivation extends to less productive points only as it becomes necessary from the fact that natural opportunities are at the more productive points fully utilized. This probably is the case in stationary or very slowly progressing communities, but in rapidly progressing communities where the swift and steady increase of rent gives confidence to calculations of further increase, it is not the case. And we're definitely in a swift or progressing community. I think his very slow progressing communities, the examples would be just something like the medieval times. In such communities, George writes, the confident expectation of increased prices produces to a greater or less extent the effects of a combination among landholders and tends to the withholding of land from use, because they are in expectation of higher prices, thus forcing the margin of cultivation. Again, that's the land that has yet to be fenced, yet to be claimed. It is available to all. Thus forcing the margin of cultivation farther than required by the necessities of production. Yes, if you think all the price of all the land is going to go up, some people are just going to buy land, not even use it, so not produce any wealth from it, which means that if we need more wealth, i.e., if we need more food, you got to produce it somewhere, so you got to start extending that margin of cultivation by claiming that unused land. This cause must operate to some extent in all progressive communities, though in such countries as England, where the tenant system prevails in agriculture, it may be shown more in the selling price of land than in the agricultural margin of cultivation or actual rent. But in communities like the United States, where the user of land generally prefers, if he can, to own it, and where there is a great extent of land to overrun, it operates with enormous power. The immense area over which the population of the United States is scattered shows this. The man who sets out from the eastern seaboard, I'm curious, USA population 1879. That went to 1810. 1880, we had 50 million people. England population 1870. Or what did we do over here? 1880 was 50 million. 1880 24 million. They were half the population in England alone. The man who sets out from the eastern seaboard in search of the margin of cultivation, where he may obtain land without paying rent, must, like the man who swam the river to get a drink, pass for long distances through half-tilled farms and traverse vast areas of virgin soil before he reaches the point where land can be had free of rent, i.e., by homestead entry or preemption. I'm not exactly sure what preemption meant historically here. I don't know. Probably just like a standing rule that anyone can claim this land that's beyond a certain point. I don't know. He, and with him the margin of cultivation, is forced so much farther than he otherwise need have gone by the speculation which is holding these unused lands in expectation of increased value in the future. And when he settles, he will in his turn take up, if he can, more land than he can use, in the belief that it will soon become valuable. And so those who follow him are again forced farther on than the necessities of production require, carrying the the margin of cultivation to still less productive because still more remote points. This makes me think of Book of Virtues, um, peasant claim land. No. Fable of peasant staking out land and dying. Is this it? Pahom? No. Interesting. I love Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. I don't know this story. And Tolstoy later became 1914. So this is going to be published 1886. I don't know. He later in life learned about Georgism, but um, Book of Virtues, list of parables. Whoa. Compassion, courage. Is there one about greed? What the event? I don't know about this. Adventures of the Book of Virtues. Alright, I know this is getting. Alright, I will just tell you. There was a story, I think, in the Book of Virtues where a man was told, Uh, Starting from this point, walk any path you want, and if you come back to this point, and then the area you cover in a big circle or square or whatever, all that land will be yours as long as you get here by the time the sun sets. If you're if you're one moment too late, you get none of it. And then the peasant, you know, makes a big circle, and he gets greedy, makes it really big, and then the sun is setting, and he's all like, "Oh shit, I gotta get back," but he's so far away because he was greedy, just start claiming a big chunk of land, and he dies, and he doesn't get his land. Or maybe he makes it back. I think he does. I think he makes it back on time, but collapses and dies. So he loses the land. However, you could make a Georgist addendum to this. He gets the land, and it passes to his heir, and his heir then, without doing any work, inherits this giant chunk of land. It is set for life. Why not? Yeah. Hello, Patrick, in the chat. Now I'm tempted to look that up. We will feel yeah. um how much to finish? All right. All right. Well, maybe we'll finish this whole chapter. We've been going for only 11 minutes, so. This George continues in his book Progress and Poverty, published in 1879. The same thing may be seen in every rapidly growing city. If the land of superior quality as to location were always fully used before the land of inferior quality were resorted to, no vacant lots would be left as a city extended, nor would we find miserable shanties in the midst of costly buildings. These lots, some of them extremely valuable, are withheld from use, or from the full use to which they might be put, because their owners, not being able or not wishing to improve them, prefer, in expectation of the advance of land values, to hold them for a higher rate than could be now obtained from those willing to improve them. And in consequence of this land being withheld from use, or from the full use of which it is capable, the margin of the city is pushed away so much farther from the center, and we get bum 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 sprawl. And of course, George was writing before the internal combustion engine. Is there such a thing as an external combustion engine? Question for the chat. I don't know. George continues. But when we reach the limits of the growing city, the actual margin of building, which corresponds to the margin of cultivation and agriculture, we shall not find the land purchasable at its value for agricultural purposes, as it would be were rent determined simply by present requirements, but we shall find that for a long distance beyond the city, land bears a speculative value based upon the belief that it will be required in the future for urban purposes, and that to reach the point at which land can be purchased at a price not based upon urban rent, we must go very far beyond the actual margin of urban use. What's funny is there's a nesting of like when I go to buy some land that's far out from the city center because I think land prices are going to keep going up, there's almost something baked in that I'm also assuming there are other speculators who have land closer into the city or more valuable land that are also not putting that to full use. I am essentially leveraging their speculation and speculating partially on their speculation. Some of the speculation is there's going to be more progress in the city, there's going to be more wealth in the city, so they're going to want people are going to want to be here, want this land, they'll have all the things that land is good for. But if I also know that there's going to be this progress, and I know that there are people downtown who are going to not even let people use their land, then there's this domino effect. And I believe this is what a lot of Georgists think is responsible for most of the boom and bust cycle, which is there's a pattern of people speculating and speculators speculating on the speculators until there's nobody actually doing the actual work, and then it all tumbles down, and then people have to start doing normal work again. And then for a while, there's really not much to speculate on because there isn't much work being done. But then as work starts getting going again and progress is happening again, then the speculators suddenly have something to speculate on again. Anyway, where were we? George writes, or to take another case of a different kind, instances similar to which may doubtless be found in every locality. There is in Marin County, within easy access of San Francisco, a fine belt of redwood timber. Naturally, this would be first used before resorting to the supply of the San Francisco market to timber lands at a much greater distance. But it yet remains uncut, and lumber procured many miles beyond is daily hauled past it on the railroad because its owner prefers to hold for the greater price it will bring in the future. We found a typo here. Bold should be hold. I don't know. Anyway, thus, by the withholding from use of this body of timber, the margin of production of redwood is forced so much farther up and down the coast range, that mineral land, when reduced to private ownership, is frequently withheld from use while poorer deposits are worked is well known, and in new states it is common to find individuals who are called land poor, that is, who remain poor, sometimes almost to deprivation, because they insist on holding land which they themselves cannot use at prices at which no one else can profitably use. To recur now to the illustration we made use of in the preceding chapter, with the margin of cultivation standing at 20. An increase in the power of production takes place, which renders the same result obtainable with 1/10 less labor. So this is back to that. We can now, off of land that was going to give us 18, will get us what the land at 20 was getting us. I mean, that's what he's going to say, even though 110% of 18 is really 18 plus 1.8, whatever. For reasons before stated, the margin of production must now be forced down, and if it rests at 18, the return to labor and capital will be the same as before, when the margin stood at 20. Whether it will be forced to 18 or be forced lower depends upon what I have called the area of productiveness which intervenes between 20 and 18. But if the confident expectation of a further increase of rents leads the land owners to demand 3 rent for 20 land and 2 rent for 19 and 1 for 18 land, and to withhold their land from use until these terms are complied with, the area of productiveness may be so reduced that the margin of cultivation must fall to 17 or even lower. And thus, as a result of the increase in the efficiency of labor, laborers would get less than before, while interest would be proportionately reduced and rent would increase in greater ratio than the increase in productive power. Whether we formulate it as an extension of the margin of production or as a carrying of the rent line beyond the margin of production, the influence of one comment I have, you know, if you suppose you just had like a finite, both in number and in time, number of speculators, like if basically there was somebody who knew, oh, we're going to have this invention or whatever, so I'm going to hold this land till the invention happens, and then the margin of cultivation goes down to, 17, and then they sell, or they put their land to use, whichever, um, then like, yeah, it's just then I don't know. Then that's what would happen. I suppose that's what I'm saying. The issue is um, a cycle of speculation, or well, I mean, A cycle of speculation is, what am I getting at here? I don't know. I guess all the speculation is pretty wasteful. I guess there's something in me that wants to say like a certain kind, and like in a lot of free market discussion, not just tied to like land discussion, people argue that speculators are providing a kind of service because they're the ones taking on risk and price signaling what are good investments and like where the money should flow. And I think most economists tend to agree. Not that I think you should form opinion based on what most economists think, but I don't know of Georgists who really argue that speculation is inherently bad or inefficient or not good in these other markets. Um, Not sure what Georgists currently think, and I personally tend to think that like it's almost like betting markets are a form of speculation and can like signal to decision makers the wisdom of a crowd. And that seems like a thing, a positive thing. And there are some economists that argue against Georgist land value tax because they think speculation is a proper and good market behavior. Um, and part of me wants to grant that there is a value in speculation, but then to say this is hugely, or this is, yeah, hugely, I don't know if I say, I will go the other. This is a tiny effect compared to the exploitation of land monopoly. Um, and a lot of people are speculating not on, oh, this land is going to be great for business. They're just sort of speculating on the fact that this area will be great for land monopoly. Um, anyway, George continues. Whether we formulate it as an extension of the margin of production or as a carrying of the rent beyond the rent line beyond the margin of production, the influence of speculation in land in increasing rent is a great that's a good way to phrase that distinction, says Patrick. Goal. Um, the influence of speculation in land in increasing rent is a great fact which cannot be ignored in any complete theory of the distribution of wealth in progressive countries. It is the force evolved by material progress which tends constantly to increase rent in a greater ratio than progress increases production, and thus constantly tends, as material progress goes on and productive power increases, to reduce wages, not merely relatively but absolutely. It is this expansive force which, operating with great power in new countries, brings to them, seemingly long before their time, the social diseases of older countries, produces tramps on virgin acres, and breeds paupers on half-tilled soils. In short, the general and steady advance in land values in a progressive community necessarily produces that additional tendency to advance which is seen in the case of commodities when any general and continuous cause operates to increase their price. Have we found it, boys and girls? Why there is poverty always alongside progress? As during the rapid depreciation of currency which marked the latter days of the Southern Confederacy, the fact that whatever was bought one day could be sold for a higher price the next operated to carry up the price of commodities even faster than the depreciation of the currency. So does the steady increase of land values, which material progress produces, operate still further to accelerate the increase. We see this secondary cause operating in full force in those manias of land speculation which mark the growth of new communities. But though these are the abnormal and occasional manifestations, it is undeniable that the cause steadily operates with greater or less intensity in all progressive societies. Yep. The cause which limits speculation in commodities, the tendency of increasing price to draw forth additional supplies, cannot limit the speculative advance in land values, as land is a fixed quantity which human agency can neither increase nor diminish. But there is nevertheless a limit to the price of land in the minimum required by labor and capital as the condition of engaging in production. If it were possible continuously to reduce wages until zero were reached, it would be possible continuously to increase rent until it swallowed up the whole produce. But as wages cannot be permanently reduced below the point at which laborers will consent to work and reproduce, it really is a shame that George didn't just use the word a living wage. Even though I always say this, when people currently talk about a living wage, they want to phrase it as a sort of a positive thing, like, oh, these people need to be paid a living wage, which I describe in the current time as being paid an amount to like live a comfortable life. Whereas George here, his idea of a wage at which you would consent to reproduce is one of absolute destitution that is just barely worth living. It's like just like better not to. It's like, you could kill yourself, or maybe it's worth eating and having a baby today. Unclear. George says, as wages cannot be permanently reduced below the point at which laborers will consent to work and reproduce, nor interest below the point at which capital will be devoted to production, there is a limit which restrains the speculative advance of rent. Hence, speculation cannot have the same scope to advance rent in countries where wages and interest are already near the minimum, as in countries where they are considerably above it. Yet, that there is in all progressive countries a constant tendency in the speculative advance of rent to overpass the limit where production would cease, is, I think, shown by recurring seasons of industrial paralysis, a matter which will be more fully examined in the next book. I think these recurring seasons of industrial paralysis, we call them recessions or depressions. So come back next time to the Henry George Daily Devotional, and we'll deal with depression, economically speaking. But George would argue there's probably a large link to psychological depression and financial depression societally, at the societal level. All right. It's good to be back. See you next time.